I want to begin by saying something very simple but very real. The world is in desperate need of understanding. Too long we have built walls instead of bridges, suspicion instead of respect. And tonight, as I stand beside King Charles, a man who, despite his royal lineage, has spent decades studying world religions and seeking dialogue, I want to talk about something many in the West still misunderstand. Islam, when people in America or Europe hear the word Islam, too often they think of conflict, extremism, or fear. That, my friends, is the result of decades of media conditioning, not reality. Because if you take the time to read, to listen, and to meet Muslims, you will find something profoundly human, deeply spiritual, and socially just within the heart of Islam. King Charles once said, we must remember that Islam is part of our past and present, and by understanding it, we can better understand ourselves. I could not agree more. When I first began studying the Islamic world, I was fascinated by the emphasis on community, on justice, compassion, and fairness. The Arabic word ummah means more than just nation. It means a community of care bound not by race or wealth, but by shared moral responsibility. Imagine if our political systems reflected that principle. If we truly believed that the suffering of one person diminishes us all, that to me is not foreign. That is universal. That is human. And it is at the heart of what I have always believed as a democratic socialist, that we are bound together, that no one should be left behind, that moral compassion must guide policy. Now, when King Charles and I spoke privately before this event, he told me something that struck me deeply. He said, Bernie, I have walked through mosques in Cairo, Istanbul, and Lahore. I have heard the call to prayer echo through the night. And in those moments, I understood something. Faith, at its best, is not about domination. It's about surrender to peace, to humility, to God. And that is something the modern world seems to have forgotten. We live in a time where arrogance is rewarded, where profit is praised, and where humility is seen as weakness. But in Islam, humility is strength. Submission to God, Islam itself, means aligning your will with something greater, something just, something beyond ego. When I read verses from the Quran, I was struck not by fear or aggression, but by beauty, by reason, by order, by the profound insistence that faith must lead to action. Stand firm for justice, even if it be against yourselves, says the Quran. Think about that for a moment. What kind of society would we have if every political leader, every CEO, every judge followed that command? Let me tell you something. If you read the Prophet Muhammad's final sermon, you find values that the modern world still struggles to achieve. Equality between races, respect for women, economic fairness, and human dignity. These are not radical ideas. They are the foundation of a just society. But somewhere along the way, the world distorted the image of Islam. It became convenient to point fingers, to create another. The irony is that the very principles Islam teaches, compassion, charity, intellectual pursuit, are the same values Western civilization claims to defend. King Charles has often spoken about the environmental ethics in Islam, how the Quran teaches respect for nature, balance, and sustainability. Think about that. At a time when corporations are destroying the planet for profit, a 1,400-year-old faith reminds us that the earth is a trust, not a possession, that we are caretakers, not conquerors. That message resonates with me deeply, because when I speak about climate change, I am not speaking only about politics or science. I am speaking about morality. It is a moral failure to destroy what sustains life. And Islam understood that long before our modern conferences and carbon reports. When King Charles addressed the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies years ago, he said something that still echoes, the Islamic world is not a problem to be solved, but a partner to be engaged. That sentence, my friends, carries enormous wisdom, because the truth is, peace will never come from dominance, it will come from dialogue. You know, I have met Muslim students, workers, and scholars across the United States and Europe, and I have seen in their eyes the same hopes every human being carries: dignity, stability, opportunity, peace. But what breaks my heart, how often they are treated as outsiders in their own countries. How many times they must defend themselves against stereotypes they never created. We cannot build a just world while demonizing an entire faith followed by nearly 2 billion people. We cannot claim to believe in freedom while tolerating prejudice, and we cannot talk about equality if we refuse to see truth beyond propaganda. When I look at the golden domes of mosques shining in sunlight, I see no threat. I see history, a civilization that gave us algebra, medicine, astronomy, architecture, and philosophy. The same civilization that preserved Greek knowledge when Europe was in darkness. Islam was not the enemy of progress, it was progress. And that's what I told King Charles. The tragedy of modern discourse is that we've forgotten history. We've allowed fear to replace curiosity, but if we are to survive as a human family, and I mean survive morally, we must reclaim that curiosity. Willingness to listen. The king nodded and said to me, "Bernie, faith is not about division, it is about connection." I smiled, because in those few words he summed up everything we both believe. Whether you wear a crown or come from the streets of Brooklyn, the path to peace is the same. It begins with humility. So to the young people listening, Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists, whoever you are, seek truth with sincerity, read, ask, learn. Don't let media headlines define your view of a billion souls. If you study the Quran with an open mind, you will find a message of balance, justice, and compassion. If you study history, you will find that Muslims and Christians once lived side by side in Spain, creating a civilization of art, poetry, and tolerance. And if you look around today, you will find countless Muslims feeding the poor, healing the sick, educating the young, standing for justice. That is the Islam I've seen. The conversation between King Charles and me may have shocked Europe, not because it was radical, but because it was honest. Because in a world addicted to noise, honesty sounds revolutionary. We didn't come together as politician and monarch. We came together as two human beings searching for truth. And the truth is this: Islam at its core is not an enemy of the West. It is a mirror reflecting the same eternal principles we all claim to value: compassion, humility, and justice. So tonight I say this: let the West rediscover Islam, not through fear, but through friendship. Let our children study not just wars, but wisdom. And let us once and for all build bridges where ignorance built walls, because the future belongs not to those who shout the loudest, but to those who listen the deepest. And that, my friends, is the beginning of peace. When I walked off that stage with King Charles, I could feel it, the tension, the silence, the awakening in the room. Some people were moved, others confused, a few perhaps uncomfortable. But that's what truth does. It shakes comfort, it forces reflection. And as I looked over at His Majesty, he smiled and said, "You know, Bernie, sometimes it takes courage to speak peace in a world that profits from fear." That sentence stayed with me for weeks, because he was right. Fear has become an industry, a product sold by politics, by media, by power. And Islam for decades has been the easiest target of that industry. It's far easier to sell fear of the unknown than to teach understanding of the divine. And so tonight I want to continue this conversation, not as a politician, not as a man from Vermont, but as a human being who believes in justice, equality, and the moral dignity of every soul on earth. Let me tell you something I've learned traveling through the world. In every culture, every village, every faith, there is one shared desire: peace. Mothers everywhere want their children safe. Fathers everywhere want dignity in their labor. Youth everywhere want a future where truth matters more than power. And if you listen closely to the Quran, to the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, you'll find those same aspirations echoing through time. God commands justice, the doing of good, and generosity to kin, says the Quran. Those are not Islamic values alone. Those are human values. They belong to all of us. But the tragedy is that we live in a world that divides the sacred into categories: Christian truth, Muslim truth, Western truth, Eastern truth, when in reality, truth has no passport, justice has no nationality, compassion speaks every language. King Charles told me during one of our private meetings at Clarence House, Bernie, the West must remember, Islam is not an intruder. It is part of our shared story. He's absolutely right. The Renaissance did not happen in isolation. The roots of modern science, medicine, and philosophy run through the libraries of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Damascus when Europe was drowning in the Dark Ages. Muslim scholars were translating Aristotle, preserving Plato, charting the stars, and creating hospitals where care was considered a duty to God. That's not mythology. That's history. And when I see people in the West dismiss Islam as something foreign, I ask them, foreign to what? Foreign to reason? Foreign to compassion? Because if you read the history of Islamic civilization, you'll find that it wasn't about conquest. It was about curiosity. The scholars of the Abbasid Caliphate didn't just memorize the world, they questioned it. They sought patterns, purpose, and balance. That is what inspired Europe's awakening centuries later. But we rarely teach that part. We speak of Newton, but not Ibn al-Haytham. We praise Da Vinci, but forget al-Jazari. We quote Socrates, but not al-Farabi. So what happens? A generation grows up believing that the West invented light, that the East lives in shadow, that falsehood breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds division. Islam, however, teaches humility, that knowledge belongs to God and humanity's role is to seek it with sincerity. That message could save our modern world from the arrogance that now threatens to destroy it. When King Charles and I spoke of faith, he said, the Quran's ecological vision is something the West should have learned long ago. And I agree, Islam's view of the earth is sacred stewardship, a trust. The Prophet said, the earth is green and beautiful, and God has appointed you as stewards over it. Compare that to our world today: burning forests, poisoned oceans, corporate greed destroying the very balance that sustains life. What Islam teaches and what science confirms is that everything is connected. Destroy nature and you destroy yourself. And maybe that's what this conversation between a monarch and a socialist is really about. Connection, the realization that truth is not owned by any single system, political or religious. It flows like light through every open heart. Let me be very clear. I am not here to preach Islam. That's not my role. But I am here to say that we must stop demonizing what we do not understand, because the moment we label something as the other, we stop listening. When King Charles spoke publicly about Islam's beauty and balance, he was attacked by some in the press. When I defended the rights of Muslims in America, I too was criticized. But that's fine, because real leadership is not about applause, it's about truth. And truth often walks a lonely road. Let me tell you a story. Years ago, I met a young Muslim woman in Michigan. She told me, Senator, I was born here. I love this country. But sometimes when I wear my hijab, people look at me like I don't belong. Her words broke my heart. How can we call ourselves civilized when we make our fellow citizens feel alien for believing in God differently? How can a society built on freedom forget that freedom begins with respect? And that's why this conversation matters, because it's not just about Islam. It's about who we are as human beings. It's about whether we still believe in moral courage. King Charles said once, we must rediscover the sacred in our modern world. I couldn't agree more, because modernity without morality is empty. It gives us technology but takes away tenderness. It gives us power but strips away purpose. Islam's call to prayer, Allahu Akbar, means God is greater, greater than our politics, greater than our pride, greater than our greed. It's a reminder that we are not the center of the universe, that humility is the beginning of wisdom. Now, you may not be Muslim, you may not even be religious, but that principle, humility, that is something we all need, because arrogance is killing the world. When King Charles and I finished our dialogue, a journalist asked me, Senator Sanders, are you saying Islam could save the West? I smiled and said, no, I'm saying understanding could. Because Islam doesn't need saving. We do. We need saving from our ignorance, our division, our moral decay. We need saving from an economy that values profit more than people, from politics that divides rather than unites, from a culture that mistakes noise for wisdom. The Prophet Muhammad said, "The best among you are those who bring benefit to others." That, to me, is the highest form of politics, service. And it's the same principle I've spent my life fighting for. Imagine, just for a moment, a world that actually lived by those words. A world where leaders saw their people not as votes, but as trusts. A world where faith was not a weapon, but a window to understanding, compassion, and collective responsibility. That's what King Charles and I spoke about. Not theology, but humanity. Not dogma, but decency. I remember standing in front of the mosque at Oxford, and as the call to prayer began, I looked at the faces around me. Young, old, black, white, men, women, different languages, different dreams, all standing still under the same sky. And I thought, this is what the world has forgotten, that in the end, we all kneel before the same Creator, even if we call Him by different names. That realization is not weakness, it is strength. It is the kind of strength that can end wars, heal wounds, and rebuild trust. You see, we often talk about power, political power, military power, economic power, but the greatest power is moral power, the power to forgive, to understand, to unite. And that is what Islam at its core teaches, that the greatest victory is not over others, but over oneself. When King Charles and I parted that evening, he said softly, "Bernie, perhaps our grandchildren will finish what we started." I hope so, because I believe the next generation is different. They're tired of division. They want truth, not tribalism. They want peace, not propaganda. They want meaning. And meaning begins with honesty, the kind we showed that night when we dared to speak about Islam, not as them, but as part of us. So tonight, if you remember one thing from this conversation, let it be this: no civilization can rise by hating what it does not understand. No faith grows through fear, and no human heart finds peace through prejudice. We can learn from Islam, its compassion, its discipline, its reverence for knowledge, its unshakable belief that mercy is greater than might. Europe, America, the entire modern world, we are at a crossroads. Either we continue down the path of arrogance, or we humble ourselves before truth. And I believe truth is not Western or Eastern, it is universal. When the Quran says, "We have created you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another," it is not just poetry, it is the moral blueprint for human survival. King Charles and I simply reminded the world of that. And maybe that's why it shocked Europe. Not because it was controversial, but because it was true. So let's keep this conversation alive. Let's speak about Islam, not with fear, but with fairness. Let's raise our children to see faith as a bridge, not a border. Let's build a world where the mosque, the church, the synagogue, and the temple all echo the same truth, that God's light shines through every heart that seeks peace, because at the end of all politics, all religion, all ambition, there is only one question left. Did we love enough to understand each other? And if we can say yes to that, then maybe, just maybe, humanity still has a chance.